My fellow Americans, welcome to The Celluloid President, the podcast about American presidents on film. Today we're discussing Rob Reiner's 2016 production of LBJ, which depicts the first 5 days of Lyndon Johnson's presidency. I'm Gary Holmes, and joining me today via Zoom from California is Jim Robinson. Jim, if you were a famous director and were offered the chance to make a movie about 5 days in a president's life, what week would that be?
I think I would pick any 5 days of the presidency of William Henry Harrison
Okay.
because then I could cover a quarter of an entire presidential term in a 2 hour movie. So I think that would be that would probably be my pick. How
Yeah, I
about
can't
you?
imagine who would play William Henry Harrison. Maybe Harrison Ford or something. He's about the right
Any,
age.
anyone could.
Yeah. No one knows what he looks like.
Right.
All
What
right.
would you pick?
Well, I think the most obvious answer would be the last 5 days of Abraham Lincoln's life, starting with Appomattox and his visit to Richmond, Virginia, which was then the capital of the defeated Confederacy, and ending in his assassination. But that's been done most
Yeah.
recently in the movie Lincoln. So, just to be different, I like to see Winston Churchill's first visit to the White House in December 22, 1941, just after the U.S. entered the war, through Christmas and culminating with his speech to a joint session of Congress on December 26, 1941. Yeah, I can imagine those boozy, cigar-filled discussions between FDR and Churchill up in the residence of the White House.
Yeah. When old Winnie supposedly didn't have any clothes on
Yeah, he was
and
walking
wanted
around
to.
naked and scandalizing Eleanor.
That would be a good one. You'd have to rate it R at least. Um, but you
For
know
all
when
the
it,
smoking.
right, yeah. But when it comes down to it, I think probably the most obvious choice is exactly the 5 days covered in this film,
Yeah, yeah.
because it really is incredible when you think about the suddenness and shocking nature of it. And then 5 days later, LBJ is speaking to joint session of Congress
Yeah.
about
No,
civil rights. So
very
maybe
dramatic
that's
5 days, yes.
Yeah, maybe that's why it's been done so much in history books and in films.
All right. Well, we've already offered our thoughts on LBJ when we discussed Selma, which was a movie about Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. For the sake of our listeners who don't commit our hot takes on U.S. history to memory, let's quickly recap what we think about LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, as the president.
Well, I tried to think about it in a fresh way, and my assessment, I think, breaks down into five big time categories.
Okay.
One, the immediate aftermath of assuming the presidency. Two, civil rights. Three, Vietnam.
Yeah.
Four, the Great Society expansion of government. And five, the ability to lead, inspire, communicate with Americans through a very divisive and violent, almost revolutionary decade. And in a nutshell, I think he was pretty successful on one and two, the assumption of the presidency and civil rights, and a pretty big failure on the rest of it. How
Yeah.
about you?
He was president when we were kids. He was not.
Yeah,
We were 9 when he became president, and 14 when he left. He's the first president I really remember. Extremely consequential, for good or bad,
yeah,
mostly bad.
absolutely.
I think we all agreed that the Vietnam War was a disaster, and it's unlikely that a wiser man like Ike, for example, would have let it happen or would have managed it so poorly. For conservatives like us, the domestic side was a disaster too. The huge expansion of the government that is bankrupting us today. His entire career was dedicated to the belief that the federal government could solve all the country's problems, which is how we ended up with a war on poverty. Yeah, he was really a man of the 1940s who accidentally became president 20 years later and was just way out of step with the zeitgeist in the 60s. I think the social revolution of the 1960s would have happened anyway, but maybe not as dramatically and as violently if a hipper, younger politician like JFK had been president instead of a corn pone character like Lyndon Johnson.
I agree with you on all points. I think that first on the personal side, we were obnoxiously precocious kids, I imagine.
You know,
And he
you
was,
were, yeah.
yeah, and he was our really our first president. And I have to admit to, even a touch of nostalgia when I see film clips because I'm recalling things that happened during my childhood. It's kind of a tragedy, really,
Yeah.
because he got great marks for the transition. He quickly passed a major tax cut, which boosted the economy. It's the biggest tax cut in history up to that time. Got civil rights done. But the problem with him, and we'd see this later in Biden, is they always wanted to fancy themselves as another FDR.
Well,
Kennedy,
he really
Clinton,
was. He really
yeah,
was another FDR in the way
right.
that Biden fortunately wasn't.
Well, but Kennedy, Clinton, and Obama were smart enough, I think, to realize that we didn't need another FDR because the social safety net had already been created. And the idea of just doubling down and tripling down on all that was ridiculous. So he had a very good start. He got some important things done early on. He got validated with a huge historic mandate, and then
Right.
he blew it. Then he blew it.
Well,
It's
and that
sad.
mandate, I mean, when you get a mandate like that, you think you can do anything you want. And he tried.
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
right. Well, at the heart of this movie is the deep personal animosity between LBJ and Bobby Kennedy. And one of history's great what ifs is what would have happened if LBJ hadn't decided to drop out of his reelection campaign in 1968 or Bobby Kennedy hadn't been shot. In this alternate universe, how would the election have played out? And I recognize that this is not part of this movie at all, except that so much of this is Bobby versus LBJ. And we're going to do a little fantasy for a second. So what is your take on how it would have played out?
Well, you really have to play 3D chess to understand 1968, what actually happened and what might have happened. And just to review, and then we'll get into our scenarios, but just to quickly review, after LBJ dropped out and Bobby Kennedy got killed, the Democrats in the fall ended up with really two candidates running, Vice President Hubert Humphrey and Alabama Governor George Wallace, a Democrat who ran on a third party ticket. The Republicans nominated Nixon, former vice president. Nixon won with just 43% of the vote, less than a percent over Humphrey. He won more comfortably in the Electoral College with 301. Wallace, as a Southern regional candidate and staunch segregationist, got 13% and carried five deep states, South states worth 46. So that's what happened. And I'm interested in this because we've never talked about what we each think might have happened had Kennedy lived and or if Johnson hadn't dropped out. I'm going to let you go first.
Well, the other thing that you didn't mention is what happened in 68 is that Bobby Kennedy was shot, and Martin Luther King was shot. And and there were riots in Chicago. It was a very tumultuous time in Chicago where the Democratic Convention was being held. So, I think that if LBJ had run, I think he actually would have won the Democratic nomination. What this movie really makes clear is that Johnson had a deep wound, sort of like Nixon, at having been born in near poverty and having been so poorly educated, and he just couldn't handle the rejection even though he won the 1968 New Hampshire primary over Eugene McCarthy, but not by a huge margin, the one that he'd hoped for. And so we just didn't want to go through the humiliating prospect of possibly losing a few primaries. But if he'd stayed in the race and bulled his way through, I think he still would have gotten the nomination, even if Kennedy hadn't been shot, because he controlled the party apparatus. Most of the delegates were chosen by party bosses, not by the primary voters. As it was, he was able to force the convention to nominate his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, even though Humphrey never even entered or won a primary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. If Johnson had stayed in, he would have certainly won the nomination, whether Bobby was alive or not. I think if with Johnson pulling out, I also believe that Humphrey most likely would have won the nomination over Bobby Kennedy. And I think that because, as you said, there weren't that many primaries yet. At the time of Bobby's death, Humphrey was well ahead in delegates already. McCarthy, Bobby Kennedy's anti war competitor, was too vain to drop out. He would have stayed in. And I think that ultimately Humphrey would have prevailed at the convention. Um, and the other thing is, I think that if LBJ sensed that Bobby was going to be able to steamroll the convention with his charisma and the martyrdom of his brother, I think Johnson would have jumped back in. In fact, there were even hints right up to the time they nominated Humphrey of Johnson teasing people with the idea that he might drop in. So I think, yes, I think he would have gotten the nomination. And I also think Humphrey would have gotten the nomination over Kennedy.
So, related to that, this movie also shows Johnson's reluctance to put himself out there, which probably cost him the nomination in 1960, which is a big part of this movie. In the movie, JFK comes to Johnson, who was then the most powerful Democrat in the country, and asks if he's going to run for president. And Johnson says no. But then he did about a month before the convention after JFK had racked up a lot of primary wins. So if Johnson had the confidence to run in the primaries, he might have beaten Kennedy, and Kennedy might not have even run in the first place if he knew Johnson was going to be in the race. So there's just something weird about Johnson. He's just so
Yeah.
sensitive and vulnerable and just sort of feels the sense of not being worthy because he grew up so poor and in a like dumb part of the country, didn't go to Harvard and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's right.
Well, folks, now you've got a grasp of the kind of things that Jim and I talk about when we're
Yeah.
not doing the podcast. We're baby boomers who can't stop talking about the 60s and the 70s,
Especially when Kennedys are involved.
especially when Kennedys are involved. Yes. I mean, all right. All right.
Well,
Let's talk
tell
about
us
what,
what you think in the comments, folks.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Tell us what you think would have happened.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to do a quick summary of the movie for those who didn't
Sure.
see it. So, the movie
Oh,
LBJ. Oh, go ahead.
we're talking about a movie, aren't we?
We're talking about a movie. Yes, we're not, and we're not talking about a movie. We're talking about 1963, 1968.
Right.
So, please forgive us this long digression away from the movie. So, back to the movie. The movie takes place over 5 days in 1963, beginning on November 22, when President Kennedy arrives in Dallas and carries on through JFK's assassination, through Johnson's ascension as president, and concludes on November 27 when he makes a cathartic speech to a joint session of Congress and rallies the country behind JFK's legislative program, including his proposed Civil Rights Act. Having said that, much of the movie is told via flashbacks, starting with the election of 1960 when he lost the presidential nomination to the more charismatic JFK, even though he was the Senate Majority Leader and the second most powerful man in Washington. We see Kennedy's selection of Johnson as his vice presidential nominee and Johnson's subsequent humiliation as vice president, where he has no influence and is kept at arm's length by the Kennedys. Two key through lines in these flashbacks are the virulent animosity between Johnson and Robert Kennedy, who was JFK's brother and attorney general, and JFK's failed attempt to make any progress in the area of civil rights. Once Kennedy is declared dead, the movie focuses on the many decisions that Johnson has to make to show respect for the dead president while also demonstrating that someone is in charge of the government. This means a lot of symbolic decisions like when, where, and how he's sworn in, how he can retain Kennedy's staff to project continuity, and finally, when he should speak to the Congress and what he should say. In the end, the movie shows him strongly endorsing Kennedy's Civil Rights Act, and several title cards report that the Civil Rights Act, which had been stymied in Congress for decades, passed overwhelmingly in 1964. By the way, that movie that the LBJ movie is available on Netflix, which is why we're doing it now. And it was directed by Rob Reiner, which has also been in the news, who's also been in the news
Yeah.
recently. I think we can charitably characterize this movie as a bomb.
Well,
Uh,
that's nothing new for us.
yeah, exactly. The movie's budget was estimated at 20 to 25 million, and its worldwide gross was 2.5 million. That's about how much popcorn was sold during the opening days of Captain America Civil War, the number one movie of the year, which had a worldwide box office of 1.2 billion, closely followed by Rogue One, Finding Dory, Zootopia, and The Jungle Book. LBJ was such a bomb that it was not even listed in the top 200 movies of the year. And to put this in further perspective, the number 200 movie of 2016 was something called Penny Pincher, and it took in $22 million, dollars, about 10 times as much as LBJ. And it got pretty bad reviews too. What do you think the problem was box office wise?
Well, I think there's several issues here. One, another movie had come out just before this movie covering almost the same material, and it's called All the Way, starring Bryan Cranston as LBJ. Came out just months before on HBO, and that was quite popular there, I understand. So this was trod upon ground. And the other thing is, as hard as it is for us to admit, unless you're a Lincoln or a Kennedy and you have a really dramatic presidency ending in violent death, I think there's probably only a niche audience for straightforward presidential biopics. We are the champions of that niche as the proprietors of the celluloid president, but it is a niche. I think that if a film dramatizes a big issue like civil rights was done in Selma or the nuclear bomb in Oppenheimer, where the presidents are there but they're ancillary, I think those films do better. But straightforward movies about this or that president, I just don't think I don't think they get a lot of traction.
Well,
What do you think?
I agree with that. And I think an even bigger problem is that the movie was conceived during the administration when the assumption was that the arc of history was bending towards justice, but was released after Trump's election when no one really wanted to reflect on the lessons of 40 years ago. I mean, everyone was just obsessed with what's going to happen next instead of what has happened in the
Yeah.
past.
I think another issue with this movie, and it's really a silly one, is they put too many F bombs in it, and therefore it was rated R.
Oh.
And there's no earthly reason why this movie needed to be rated R. They could have still shown the earthy side of LBJ and some of his outrageous kinds of behavior. But because they use two, you can use one or two F bombs as adjectives in a film and not get a R rating. But if you use more than that, or if you use an F bomb as a verb, if people can follow what I'm saying,
Yeah.
then you get an R rating. And I think an R rating on this kind of film is totally unnecessary, and it probably hurt.
No, well, I'm sure you're right about that. I mean, but even if they had doubled the box office, it still would have only been $5 million, which still would have been a bomb. And I have a feeling that when a movie is this disastrous, I think the studio just gives up on it, and they don't want to spend it. They don't want to throw good money after bad. They don't spend a lot of money advertising it. And I think they knew after they'd made it and seen it, and then were aware of what the market was like and how everyone was like freaked out over Trump, that it was just like a lost cause. And I just don't, I think they just threw it in the
Mm-hmm.
theater to see who would come. And I mean, it's sort of like when the Reagan movie that we saw was not promoted very aggressively, although it did a lot better than this.
Yes.
Um, by the way, I did, for comparison's sake, I did watch about 45 minutes of All the Way. And by the way, that title comes because his slogan in 1964 was All the Way with LBJ.
Right.
So, I watched the first 45 minutes of it. Bryan Cranston plays Johnson. And in that movie, the assassination and speech to the joint session of Congress, which is basically what LBJ is about, only takes up about 5 minutes, and the
Hmm.
rest of the movie is about pushing through the civil rights bill. A lot that Martin Luther King's in it a lot, and it's all about Humphrey wants to do this, and LBJ wants to do this, and Richard Russell wants to do that. And it culminates with his election in 1964. Again, I didn't watch it all the way through because, and just in case for whatever reason we decide to watch it to discuss this like 3 years from now, it was just an interesting that they're the same topic. This both about biopics about Johnson, but one focuses on 5 days and one focuses on 13 months.
Yeah, and more about the legislative process, maybe.
Yeah. So this movie was made by Rob Reiner, who was allegedly murdered by his own son last year. So, and we all remember that very vividly. It's hard to separate our thoughts about the movie from our thoughts about Reiner. Let's talk about Reiner for a moment. What's your reaction?
Well, I cut my teeth like a lot of people did with his role as Meathead
Yeah.
in All in the Family,
Yeah.
and also the son of Carl Reiner from the Dick Van Dyke Show. I haven't seen a lot of his movies, but Spinal Tap is one of my all-time favorite movies. Politically, I look at him sort of the way I look at Robert De Niro. Both are way over the top on politics, almost deranged, and I don't care. I can see their films and appreciate their talents without being subjected to all the inanities. But don't put me in front of any award shows where they're speaking or in front of their social media. I think it's possible to stick to the talent and separate that out from the politics and the artistry. And it shouldn't be surprising because conservatives like us are well practiced in this regard. We've had to do this our entire lives.
I mean, you're right. I mean, he's Hollywood royalty, beneficiary of extreme white privilege. All in the Family, absolutely. That's where we all know him from. And then Spinal Tap, but also The Princess Bride, When Harry Met Sally, Misery, A Few Good Men, The Sure Thing, and The American President with Michael Douglas and Annette Bening. And then weirdly, his directorial career floundered. It's like he used up all his creative capital or luck early in his career and spent decades trying to recapture it. He's better known now for his political advocacy. He's kind of I mean, I thought he was more like a normie liberal, not crazy progressive and obnoxious, but fundraising for candidates, pushing for more government spending on education, big supporter of gay marriage, active in environmental issues. He's classic California Hollywood liberal, more prominent than most because he was outspoken on so many issues. I mean, he was all over the place, everything he had to mouth off about. But having said that, I will give him credit that these political opinions do not permeate his successful movies.
Right,
And they
right.
don't really permeate this one either.
No, I don't think so. And I think I actually think that the left could take a lesson from longtime conservatives like us. As I said, all our lives we've had to segregate the artists that we like, their political views from their artistry. And you don't see that. You see ostracization and canceling, and when you see Hollywood blacklisting conservative actors now, and all those kinds of things. And as long as I don't have to listen to it, I can enjoy their art. Problem is when artists don't let you separate.
Yeah.
Like you can't go to a Bruce Springsteen concert anymore if you're of a certain point of view, because you're going to pay hundreds of dollars for a ticket to get lectured not very intelligently about politics.
Okay.
Why do it? No matter how good the songs are.
All right. So, what was the movie trying to accomplish? This is one of those movies in which it's hard to say who the auteur actually is. It was written by a guy named Joey Hartstone and produced by a consortium of 4 independent film companies. Reiner was hired to direct the movie, but I strongly suspect he didn't change the script very much. Having said that, what do you think the movie and its various creators were trying to say?
Well, I think the purpose is to rescue and resuscitate the the LBJ presidency, the image and the legacy from the trash bin of presidential history. It's Democrats polishing up one of their more problematic presidents, using the framework that while Kennedy was a man of big ideas, Johnson was the man of action and effectiveness who could actually get those big ideas done. and never mind his personal flaws.
Yeah, I mean, in that respect, it reminds me of the Spielberg movie Lincoln, which is also a detailed look at how power operates, and both use civil rights as the end to which the president is striving. We see LBJ twisting arms, cajoling, massaging egos, making backroom deals, and using eloquent, persuasive speeches. And I think the movie's trying to say that old-fashioned politics is good and that we should respect those who wield it. At the same time,
Yeah.
I think the movie's trying to redeem the reputation of Lyndon Johnson, as you point out, which is who's loathed on the left because of the Vietnam War and on the right for his expansion of big government.
Yeah, I think the idea is to advance the country, you need a Kennedy, but every Kennedy needs a Johnson.
Yeah.
The one thing you don't need is a Republican, even though
Oh,
the Republicans played a major, major role in getting the civil rights issues moving forward.
oh,
And I think also it's kind of a story of repenting and redemption, a Southern taking on the racists in his
yeah.
own region, or some would say his fellow racists in his own party, in his own region. People like those kind of redemptive man bites dog fables.
What did you like about the movie?
Well, and my likes and dislikes are going to overlap with topics that we usually discuss later on, but just overall, I think this film is pure catnip for the celluloid president. It's not great art or great cinema, but it is full of meetings, specific events, fly on the wall observations of how big politicians interacted with each others, all credibly staged and performed. I think this is exactly the kind of movie that celluloid president fans live for.
I like the narrow focus of the movie. As you know, I complained last time when we discussed The Iron Lady, the biopic about Margaret Thatcher, that it tried to cover too much and gave a shallow account of what she accomplished. This was a show don't tell movie where they actually showed you how politics work. So I like that.
Right,
Um,
right.
I, I like that they tried to be fair to LBJ, both his strengths and weaknesses. They showed that he was remarkably crude and didn't mind conducting meetings when he was sitting on the toilet, but also that he understood how to get things done and was not the racist Southerner that everyone thought he was.
Yeah, yeah. I also like that it had the guts to take Bobby Kennedy down a few pegs.
Yeah.
That's kind of a heresy in Hollywood. And but they did it. And in fact, all of the Kennedy aides, the cabal that at one point got together to conspire how to get rid of LBJ so that Bobby could ascend, all came off looking kind of bad and petty. And it had a lot of realistically documented detail. The sitting on the toilet scene, the scene where he's ordering his specially tailored pants, um, lying on the floor of the limo after JFK was shot. All the first speech, all these things really happened. They were details ripped right from the pages of history.
I agree with you. I was glad to see that RFK was the villain in this. I mean, he's one of those historical figures like Woodrow Wilson and Thomas Jefferson that I just can't stand. And I was glad to see him exposed as the nasty, vengeful figure that he really was. So go on, go, Rob Reiner.
I wouldn't go that far, but I get it. I get it. I just thought it was surprising that they were willing to portray Bobby in such a poor light.
I'm very surprised because you would think that Rob Reiner, as a Hollywood liberal, would have been more respectful of
Right,
Bobby and wouldn't have gone after him so hard.
right.
All right, what didn't you like?
Well, there were lots of sins of omission, which is the downside of what you pointed out about the
Yeah,
narrow focus.
yeah.
It's like Martin Luther King and his movement didn't even exist. It barely mentioned Vietnam. The race riots that happened despite the civil rights legislation, the counterculture, the generation gap, um, and the following up of the big tax cut with wild guns and butter spending that wrecked a good economy. Some of that was mentioned, as you said, in some captions at the end. And I understand they wanted to keep the focus on that which would redeem LBJ and Kennedy, turning ideas into action. So those are my main complaints.
When I watch a movie, I mean, yes, this is not by any stretch of the imagination an exhaustive portrait of the Johnson administration. The movie's only an hour and a half long, and it's not designed to be an exhaustive takedown of the Johnson presidency. It's really focused on a particular moment in history. So, I mean, in a way, you can't really blame it for what it's just decides to focus on. When I watch a movie like this, though, it makes me wonder if a director like Rob Reiner was more lucky than talented with his early success, because I find the filmmaking itself, the direction, the cinematography, the editing, the writing, just kind of pedestrian. Although the subject matter is cinematic as can be, the movie just seems a little flat. Not exactly boring, but not as gripping as a Steven Spielberg movie would be. So it's like
Hmm.
the filmmaking itself, I don't really love.
Yeah, I didn't have a problem with that, and I was never bored. Again, not because I would laud this as cinematic art, but just because I love seeing being a fly on the wall in the way real politicians interact with each other
Yeah.
and decide things and all that. As long as it's done with reasonable credibility, then for me as a political junkie, I'm okay with it. I think another thing I wouldn't necessarily say was a dislike. I think they punted in the final analysis on where they come down on LBJ. Was he really committed to civil rights or not? If you think about it, most of the discussions that he had in the film were tactical, not moral, in terms of being for civil rights. I know he told a few stories about his poor black servant or whatever, who didn't want to drive through the deep South and all that, and how that was terrible. Good for him. But if you think about it, every time the issue of the bill came up, it was really tactics. Well, when should we do it? How should we do it? Should there be compromise? No, there shouldn't be compromise. And I think that's because the record is mixed on the part of LBJ. Did he have a JF Kennedy deathbed conversion? Or was he just doing this for politics, recognizing that if he ever wanted to be a national figure, even though he had just become president, you can't be a national figure in the Democratic Party by just being a Richard Russell kind of, person on civil rights. And so I don't think they knew where to land on the penultimate question of what were LBJ's real motives and his real belief.
I actually think that they credit LBJ with being a supporter of civil rights and an advocate for it. There's a lot of scenes where he's with Gristle, and we'll talk about these scenes later because
Yeah.
so we'll talk about that then.
Yeah,
Um,
but I would just say also a case in point was that absurd scene where his limousine pulls up in front of Lincoln's statue
yeah,
and he looks up at Lincoln and he says, um, it's you that got me into this effing mess, and now I'm going to get us out of it. What the hell does that mean? Does that mean it was inconvenient for Lincoln to have freed the slaves? I mean, to me, that was the penultimate example of they didn't really know how to assess LBJ. And the one final thing I'd say about that is they could have, it is possible to be for that legislation
yeah.
and still be a racist. The two are not mutually exclusive.
Well, yeah, I
You
think he
can
was
have you
probably a racist in the same way that most people were back then, which is that they thought that races had different characteristics and different strengths and
different,
all that kind of thing. And which,
right? Exactly.
so I think he was probably a racist, but a racist who thought that blacks should have the opportunities to rise above their limitations, right?
Right.
So in that respect, he was, I think even most of the most supporters of civil rights sort of had that same idea that, it's unfair to not let them vote, not let blacks, participate fully to the extent that their talent shouldn't be kept down.
Yeah. Well, Lincoln was Exhibit A.
Well, Exhibit A of that, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, or
Yeah.
and of course Jefferson. All
Yeah.
right. Of all the senator, so I got there's one other thing I didn't like about the movie, which is that all the senators are clearly delineated, but the staff all merged together. I can't tell them straight. Which one's Ken O'Donnell? Which one's McGeorge Bundy? Are Jack Valenti and Bill Moyers even in this movie? They're all a blur, and it matters because a key subplot is that LBJ wants to keep Kennedy's staff to remain. LBJ wants Kennedy's staff to remain in order to show them that the government isn't falling apart. But you can't tell who's saying yes and who's saying no. And related to this, I suspect that a couple of key scenes were cut because there are a lot of people in the credits, including Rich Summers as Pierre Salinger, who didn't appear in the final film. Maybe if the movie had been a little longer, we would have been able to differentiate the supporting cast. But the staff is just all one big white guy.
Yeah, I noticed that. It didn't bother me, but because you did get a sense of some of the real names. And they talked about Pierre and they talked about, especially Ted Sorensen had a
Well,
couple
Ted
really good
Sorensen
scenes.
was the only one that I could tell apart.
Yeah.
All right, let's discuss the actors. Woody Harrelson played LBJ. The movie lives or dies on his performance. What do you think?
I thought he was very believable and credible. He didn't look much like LBJ, but he had that perpetual dyspeptic look on his face that Johnson had. I think you needed a sometimes comedic actor to portray LBJ because they wanted to treat some of the outrageous conduct in a comedic light. I feel sorry for the cameraman though, because Woody is only 5'9", and Johnson was 6.3, is 6'3", and known for moving in close and towering over his target. I'm telling you, I liked him. I was drawn in. It didn't, even though I had seen Johnson all my growing up, I I I was never that distracted by the fact that it wasn't Johnson I was looking at.
Well, Woody, of course, is most famous to me as the innocent but dim bartender in Cheers. Like LBJ, he was born into poverty in Texas, but Woody had an even worse start than Johnson because his father was convicted of murdering a federal judge. I
Right.
mean,
And at one time claimed he was the shooter in the JFK assassination.
so when you
But
got a dad like that, I mean, you're really kind of not off to a good start.
yeah,
After Cheers, he started a number of very intense roles, including as E. Howard Hunt in the HBO series The Plumbers, which we might cover one day if we really want to wallow in Watergate.
we
Um,
do.
Harrison Harrelson got some bad reviews for this part here, but I think he's pretty good. I agree with you. He
Yeah.
showed two sides of Johnson, the commanding master of the Senate who steamrolled everyone, and the lonely, insecure man who wouldn't commit to run for president in 1960 because he was waiting for a groundswell of public support. So I thought he was very good. I was very surprised. Bryan Cranston is also a sometime comedic actor. He was also good in that HBO movie All the Way. They are neither of them really look like Johnson, but after a while, you kind of believe that they are Johnson.
Yeah, I think, Harrelson's a Texan, as you said. And I haven't seen him in much. I saw The People versus Larry Flint, where he got one of his three Oscar nominations, Best Actor in that film. And that he was very good in that, kind of a tawdry subject, but it was an interesting movie. And I never watched Cheers, of course. But isn't it interesting how that TV show can spawn a number of big stars and others like Friends, maybe with the exception of Jennifer Aniston, can't? It's just interesting how some shows can spawn big movie stars afterwards, and others can't. I just,
I know. Well, just sometimes it happens.
yeah.
Jennifer Jason Leigh is Lady Bird Johnson. What did you think about her?
Well, Lady Bird in real life did, in fact, have a pretty syrupy, pronounced Texas drawl. But I think Lee went a little too far with it. I think she was too syrupy. She was okay as the supportive wife. Um, of course, completely unmentioned were LBJ's many affairs, the
It
nude
was only
swimming in
five
the.
days. I mean, you couldn't.
I know,
That was the
but
5 days where he probably wasn't around his mistress. Yeah,
he had a little more to do, maybe a little too much to do. And there were charges, credible charges of personal corruption,
right.
some of which included her with her
Oh yeah.
television
Well, Lady Bird
stations.
had supposedly had all these
The only
TV
one that could get
station
licenses.
owned all these TV stations in Texas.
And it's funny that no one else could get licenses. Um, Jennifer Jason's Lee's just a point of interest. Her father was Vic Morrow, who starred in combat on TV and was later killed on set filming The Twilight Zone.
Until I looked into this, I thought that just Jennifer Jason Lee was related somehow to Janet Lee. And I didn't, and
Hmm.
then I found out, no, it was Vic Morrow, actually.
Yeah.
It was a surprise to me that Jennifer Jason Lee was old enough 10 years ago to play Lady Bird. I remember her in Fast Times at Ridgemont High from
Yeah.
1982 and Single White Female. I just still think of her as being like 20, 25, 30. Out of all the imitations in the movies, I thought she did the best job of portraying the person that she was supposed to be. I mean, I thought she actually looked like Lady Bird, and
Hmm.
she's pretty solid as a confidant and a supportive spouse, but not as someone that interests herself in policy matters. She was a little bit syrupy, agreed there. It's hard to tell because she's one of these people that was, pretty quiet, pretty retiring. First lady. We don't see a lot of her other than when she was talking about her beautification program in which she got all the billboards pulled down in America, so it didn't look so trashy. All right.
Yeah, she was fine. I have no problem with her.
So there's one deeply conservative senator in the movie, Richard Russell, played by Oscar nominee Richard Jenkins, nominated for The Visitor in the Shape of Water, and one deeply liberal senator on the other side, Ralph Yarborough, played by Bill Pullman. Any thoughts on either of these?
I thought Jenkins was particularly good, and Pullman was fine. I know you didn't mean it this way, but I take issue with necessarily calling Richard Russell a conservative. A racist is not a conservative in my book. A conservative hates racism and hates reverse racism, but that's my little lecture. I don't know enough about Richard Russell. I'm sure he was a hawk in Vietnam, but for all we know, maybe he had been a full-on FDR liberal domestically. But it was interesting they didn't make him to be a raving, slobbering lunatic, but rather well spoken.
Well, I think I also agree that Richard Jenkins is good as Richard Russell. We see in the movie that LBJ and Russell are close, but if anything, it understates their relationship. When LBJ came to Washington, he established two deeply personal relationships with powerful father figures who didn't have any sons of their own, and that would be Speaker of the House Sam Rayburn and Georgia Senator Richard Russell. So they were very, very close. In fact, they had dinner together every Thursday. The Russells and the Johnsons had dinner together every night, every Thursday night for years and years. Both Rayburn and Russell advanced his career, but they also provided a lot of emotional support. Russell was a powerful figure because he was actually very smart. He's a very keen intellect, but he was an outright racist. I don't know much about Yarborough, except that he was one of those woolly headed liberals for whom making a speech was more important than making compromises that advanced the ball for the cause. In any event, Bill Pullman is an actor that I don't like at all. And every time I see him in the movie, I want to punch him in the face because he's just so self-righteous. He's just, I don't like him. So I,
Okay.
Jenkins, good, Pullman, bad.
Okay.
All right. Jack and Bobby Kennedy are played by two relatively unknowns, unknown to me at least, Jeffrey Donovan and Michael Stahl David, respectively. Very hard to play Jack Kennedy because he's so charismatic, and Jeffrey Donovan is not that. And Michael Stahl David seems closer to Bobby because he has that rabbity intensity. Bobby, of course, was the runt of the Kennedy family growing up and a mean, vengeful guy. What do you think about them? You agree with that?
Kind of the opposite of what you
Okay.
just
All
said.
right.
We've seen Jeffrey Donovan before. He played Bobby in J. Edgar, and
Right.
they together had one of the best scenes in that movie.
Right.
So this is obviously his little cottage industry. He's from Massachusetts. I don't know if that has anything to do with it. I thought he was pretty good in terms of that officious and detached nature that JFK had while letting Bobby and others do his dirty work.
Yeah.
The Irish Mafia and all that. Um, I thought Stahl David, sounded like Bobby, but he was too soft and pretty looks wise. Bobby had a very interesting face, but not a pretty face.
Yeah.
And
It looked a
the
lot
other
like
thing,
Rose.
yeah, but the other thing is going back to my height obsession. It was again a challenge for the cameraman because the actor that played Bobby was 1 inch taller than Woody Harrelson, and they had these dramatic scenes together. They must have really had to like lie on the floor with the camera in a very unusual angle. But I thought they were. It's very tough going to do the
I
Kennedys,
know. It's very, very
and
rough.
and I thought fine, very okay, okay, buddy,
That's exactly. I mean, I think they're okay. I mean,
yeah.
they both do a credible job. No one would think that they are actually the Kennedys, though, and because you're right, the Kennedys are extremely distinctive in the way they come off. Anyone else in the movie you want to call out?
I did like the you're right about the minor characters sort of blending together. But I did like Ted Sorensen
Mhm.
sort of stood out. He seemed to be have a more mature reaction to a new president than the petulant one of Bobby and the other aides. Um, I really liked his snippet of a scene where he was sitting there in front of LBJ while LBJ was editing his speech text. Only and no words were spoken, but only because been there, done that.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
an agonizing
exactly.
exercise for a speechwriter to go through. And so I just appreciated him. He stood out to me.
All right, let's turn to the history. I think this might be the most historically accurate movie we've seen. I couldn't find any references to this movie being based on Robert Caro's biography of Johnson. It's called The Passage of Power.
Mhm.
Uh, but there should have been. I read the book when it came out in 2012, and every plot point I checked after watching the movie was right there in the book. I mean, it's like they literally they went to those
Right.
50 pages and they tore stuff out. Bobby Kennedy really did try to convince Johnson to turn down the vice presidency after JFK offered it to him. Johnson really did call Bobby Kennedy at the Justice Department to ask whether he thought the swearing in should take place immediately, and then rejected the advice to delay it until they came back to DC, and on and on and on. It goes, there was so much in this movie came almost word for word out of that book.
Yeah, I read that book too, and it's where I actually reassessed LBJ a little bit
Yeah.
in terms of the way he handled the transition.
Hmm.
I think really it was incredible. And, I have to just give him big credit for that. I thought the reenactments of Dallas, even though I didn't like all the cutaways during the motorcade to earlier points in history, but I thought the reenactment of the Dallas terror and the announcement of the death and all that was good. I thought the 1960 convention reenactments um, were effective. The use of some film clips and real speeches, especially Johnson's speech to Congress at the end of the movie. The Bobby hatred was real and not exaggerated. And so I think, again, it's the sins of omission that sort of stood out to me. And also, I think that I have a historical problem with this conceit that we've discussed that a man of big ideas, Kennedy, and a man of big action, Johnson, were the ones that delivered civil rights. Both JFK and LBJ tried to water down Eisenhower's civil rights bill in 1957, which happened to be the first civil rights bill to pass since Reconstruction, not the 64 bill. Ike made the first national speech on race, not Kennedy, and sent the first federal troops to enforce judicial orders. And so historically, I think this was in part a cleanup, a Democratic cleanup operation.
Yeah.
Deal with two views that had taken hold. One, that JFK didn't really do much as president, in part because he didn't have much time. And number two, that Johnson was a failure, and turn that into Johnson had grand ideas, but not enough time. Lyndon had the skills to get it done. So, but I don't really fault the harping on the civil rights bill because it was a genuine achievement. Johnson does deserve a lot of the credit, but it's also a bill that passed the Senate 73 to 27, with a greater percentage of Republicans voting for it in their caucus than Democrats. So I just don't think it was rounded out historically on the progression of the civil rights issue.
Well, of course, I mean, right, because, and that's what all the way is, will give you a better sense of how the bill actually got passed.
Okay.
Yeah, in this, you would think to watch this movie that there were no Republicans at all in Congress.
Right.
They mentioned Dirksen at one point. Johnson calls Dirksen on the phone. I think that's about it. There's no
Yeah,
other
and
Republicans.
Dirksen voted for it.
And he was the
Yeah.
majority leader. He was the Senate
Yeah.
minority leader,
He,
Republican leader, and he threw his weight behind it. And you're right.
right.
The Republicans voted for it. Democrats didn't, and which is ironic because after it passed, all those Democratic states turned Republican. You know, all the states that voted for Wallace eventually became Republican states.
Yeah. Eventually is the operative word, though.
Eventually,
And
yes.
going back to my regional pride point, because just 8 years later, after 68, which we talked about, Jimmy Carter ran, who was much more of a heretic on civil rights than Johnson, and he swept the South. He swept the entire South, including Florida.
All right, let's talk about some of the favorite scenes.
Okay. I love the I love the scene of Johnson conducting a meeting while sitting on the toilet. It's where because it's where you really needed a comedic actor, and it's also based in reality. But it had a lot of little hilarious touches, like when he's finished, LBJ uses his hand towel to fan away the air in the bathroom, and then he finishes wiping his hands, and then he hands the towel to a hapless aide whose look on his face is priceless. I just, I mean, I know it's a little scatological, but it lightened a movie like this and gave some presidential folklore is one of the things that presidential history buffs like. I thought it was well done.
I like the scene where Richard Russell is at LBJ's house for dinner and they're talking about civil rights. And, um, the black maid is serving them. And Russell is such a racist that he doesn't even care that she's in the room when he's saying racist things. And he can't believe that Johnson would ever sit down and eat dinner with her, probably not remembering that when Johnson was poor in a small rural town, he probably ate many meals with black people when he was growing up. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so in this and the scene also has that long story you were talking about where LBJ's declined to drive his dog from Washington to Texas because it was hard for her to find a place to sleep, eat, or pee. That scene, by the way, is also in All the Way. That story, he tells that story to Martin Luther King instead of to Richard Russell, which is an interesting choice. So I guess this story is something he must have told more than once. But in this case, they decided to show it. Show him saying it to the racist, and in the other movie they have him showing it to Martin Luther King, probably just to show that he was serious, he understands the issues.
And God only knows if it's a true story.
Yeah,
I mean, I don't know if there's ever been any. I can't. I didn't read the earlier stuff of Caro, but who knows if it's true?
well, if it
On
was
the
apocryphal,
surface,
it's believable. I mean,
yeah,
that
but on
totally.
the surface, really, why would you have somebody drive your? Can't didn't he have the power and the wherewithal to arrange to get the dog flown? I mean, it doesn't. That's one of those stories that's too good to check.
Well,
I'll leave it at that.
okay, I will tell you though, in the other book, in the other movie, he doesn't mention the dog. He just says when his cook has to drive down to the south, she has to stop. There's no place for her to stop.
Okay.
Um, but in any event, it
It
just
was a
goes to
good
show
scene. It
you
was
what.
uncomfortable.
Huh?
I was uncomfortable watching that scene.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I thought it was. Yeah, it was supposed to make you uncomfortable. That's why it's one of
Right,
my
right.
favorite movies, my favorite scenes, because it shows you what racism was actually like, where you could, racists had no compunction about insulting the people that were serving them, inadvertently,
Right.
or advertently.
Well, they just didn't acknowledge that they existed as people.
Okay, anything else?
Well, I liked, again, on the comedic side, I liked when he was ordering his specially made pants from his tailor, and how he needed more room for his privates than most men. And the reason I liked it, in addition
Or
to
he
the,
called it his nutsack. Yeah, you need
yeah,
more.
it was, yeah, and Bunghole was in that with it
Bunghole,
too.
that the scene
Yeah,
needed the
I know.
scene shouldn't come all the way up there to his bunghole.
I wasn't going to go into all those details, but the one reason I liked it, other than the sort of comedic relief, this is right out word for word of a tape recording
Yeah,
on the phone that exists on YouTube.
yeah.
And by the way, if anyone is interested in more on Johnson, YouTube's got a lot of fascinating recorded phone conversations and meetings that include calls with Jackie, Bobby, J. Edgar Hoover, and Richard Russell, and a whole bunch of people, and they're fascinating. Johnson really knew how to work the phones.
And the reason
Um,
we have those tapes is because Johnson bugged the White House just like
that's
Nixon
right.
did.
Right. Nixon wasn't lying when he said Johnson had done it too. And but the reenactment that Woody did in that scene was just perfect, right down to the belch. At one
Yeah.
point at the end of the call, he burps a little bit. Well, sure enough, on the actual tape, LBJ burps. So I mean, it just shows they were getting into the folklore, and I liked it.
Okay. And I mean, you said the movie was ripped from history, but it was really ripped from Caro's book and these videos,
Yeah, and the recordings. Yeah,
Okay. I like this. I found the swearing in on the plane very moving because it's such a historic photograph that
right.
we've seen of Johnson being sworn in with Jackie standing right next to him. And it's very haunting to watch how they maneuver to get that picture taken. And it's funny, I didn't realize that the swearing in and the photo were taken on the plane before it took off. I always just assumed that they were in the air when
Oh, oh
I
yeah.
thought they
Okay.
came and they got off and they took off as soon as possible. No, they waited at the airport until they could get everything put together and Jackie would come out of the compartment and pose for the picture. And then they took off.
Yeah, they had to make the cabin of the plane wider than it really was
Yeah,
for the film, because Air Force One was just a 707
right.
in those days. So they took a little license there, but it was a very good scene.
According to the Robert Caro book, there were 28 people in that
And it
room.
was sweltering.
It was sweltering, yeah. And they were just squeezed in there. You can't really tell that from the photograph. You get a better sense of it from the movie, how compact everyone was.
Right. But if you were that close to begin with, who wouldn't want to be in there?
Oh, yeah. I
You
mean,
know, I
although
mean,
I
it's,
went back and looked at the picture and you can hardly make out any faces besides, Johnson, Lady Bird, and Jackie.
yeah.
Okay. Anything else?
It
Favorite?
was there were fun scenes between Bobby and LBJ. I like the one where they're in the elevator at the convention after Johnson decided to run after all, and Bobby, even with other people in the elevator, Bobby accuses Johnson of lying about not running. And Johnson immediately turns around and he says, "Well, yeah, and I guess John JFK doesn't have Addison's disease." Like they were both lying. I like
Um,
that.
all right. How about some favorite lines?
Well, yeah, I'll segue to scenes to lines with another favorite scene full of favorite lines, and that is the speech to Congress.
Oh,
I thought
well,
that
yeah.
was well done.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
was,
That was very
and,
powerful. Yeah.
and I read the whole speech a couple days ago, and it really was a great speech. Of course, it mentioned other things than civil rights. It
Oh, sure.
mentioned we're
Yeah.
going to keep our commitment to South Vietnam and a laundry list of other things. But civil rights was first. And I think it showed that even problematic presidents might have one great speech in them, as George W. Bush did right after 9/11.
One of my favorite lines was, well, you know, Carl, there are two kinds of horses, show horses and work horses,
Mm-hmm.
which, is someone who makes a lot of good speeches and someone who actually gets the job done.
Right. I
Um,
like I like the one where Johnson confronts Bobby about his presidential ambitions for 1968 after it was presumed JFK would finish his second term. And Bobby says, Lyndon, you really think I'd be that calculating? And Johnson says, I know I would be. The truth is, they both were.
yeah. When LBJ is a Senate Majority Leader and JFK is a junior senator and goes down hunting with Johnson in Texas,
Yeah.
and it doesn't go very well. And LBJ says, I'm guessing you Kennedys don't do a lot of deer hunting. JFK says, well, when Kennedys fire weapons, it's usually at Nazis. And Johnson responds, lots of Nazis in Hyannisport.
I know that was a great line. Even though I don't think, unless they're thinking about Joe Jr., um, they didn't shoot at Nazis. They shot at Japanese.
Well, Johnson did, but Joe went,
Yeah,
obviously died shooting at Nazis.
yeah.
But I mean, it's just that macho on
Oh,
macho.
it's
Like one
great.
more
Yeah.
macho than the other. It's like ridiculous.
Speaking of macho, when he's explaining to aides that he could get the uh, civil rights bill done after the assassination, and they were all saying, "No, you can't." And he said, "Never underestimate the power of a martyr's cause, or the
Yeah.
size of a Texan's balls."
Yeah. Well, Power of the Martyrs,
Oh
it's
yeah,
very powerful. Okay. When he's trying to decide whether to take the vice presidential nomination, he says, Walter, how long have you been with me? 21 years. And in 21 years, can you think of a time when I have taken over a new office and not made it 100 times more powerful than when I got there? No, sir. Power is where power goes. And that I mentioned because he was so spectacularly wrong. He was
yes.
totally emasculated by the Kennedys when he was vice president. That he didn't do anything. He lost all his power. He lost everything, and he was humiliated. And sometimes a good line is
But
good
wrong
because
is
it's
wrong.
so wrong.
Yeah, I thought it was. I don't know if they tried to make these points, but when we saw LBJ as Senate Majority Leader
Yeah,
and his wheeling, dealing, and his lobbying, you really could see that that was the job he was made for,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
not president. He was great. I mean, I didn't like everything he tried to do, but he was effective.
yeah,
And the other thing is that I sort of thought of the tantalizing prospect was when Bobby went to the hotel to try to get him to reject the vice presidential offer. And we had just seen in a scene or two before Johnson really not sure he wanted to take it.
yeah.
That maybe reverse psychology worked there. And Bobby is the reason LBJ took it because if Bobby said,
I think that we're supposed to kind of think
yeah,
that Bobby pushed him. Maybe it
and the
wasn't the
opposite,
ultimate reason, but yeah.
yeah,
um, Bobby trying to convince JFK not to pick LBJ. He says, I mean, Johnson and his men have spent the last 72 hours trying to convince the entire delegation that you have Addison's disease. And JFK says, I do have Addison's disease.
right, yeah, I know that.
And he says, that's the point.
Yeah, that was good. I
Anything
don't
else?
have any more. No.
I got one more. Um, when he's Senate Majority Leader and is trying to get the other senator from Texas, Ralph Yarborough, to vote for something, he first says, the only thing that's more irritating than a liberal is a liberal from Texas. And then when Yarborough says that his constituents do not want him to vote for it, Johnson says, your constituents are my constituents. Just because after 3 failed attempts at the governor's mansion, you finally managed to win an election hardly makes you an expert on Texas voters. And, it's kind of hard. It's odd to hear Johnson deride liberals because except for FDR, he was probably the most liberal president in history. But I
Yeah,
think what he means by liberals is someone who's a show horse, who makes a lot of speeches and won't do the grubby work of making compromises. I mean, that's his idea of a liberal. Not It's more of an attitude of being too good to get your hands dirty.
right, right.
And then I'll just say one thing. My least favorite line was when Ted Sorensen finally agreed to write LBJ's speech to a joint session of Congress. And Johnson said, "Good, you've got 24 hours." And I thought I was going to be sick at the thought of delivering a polished address in 24 hours. All right, relevance or comparisons to politics and society today. Why is this relevant?
I think on several scores, I think the whole issue of do you want a workhorse or a show horse
Yeah, okay.
is an important issue that we're grappling with. How tolerant are we going to be of peccadillos and crude behavior in politicians, which I think is extremely relevant because you can find similarities between LBJ and the current president. It's just that both the nature of the man and the nature of just in time media and communication puts all this stuff on display instantaneously instead of us reading about it 50 years later in books. So I think the whole question of demeanor of presidents and how slick or not slick they need to be is relevant. And also the lost art of legislative horse trading.
Yeah.
I think it's, again, the civil rights issue, by the numbers anyway, was not a divisive issue. It was a consensus issue. It was a 73 to 27 vote in the Senate. There was regional divisiveness over it. So, and the idea that Republicans and Democrats, even though Republicans weren't given credit in this film, could come together on big questions like civil rights, I think is something to think about today because we don't see that anymore. That
Well, the thing about civil rights back then was that it was being held up by the Senate, which was, because the southern states had the seniority and all the important committees,
right,
because their senators were there for like 50 years. They were all old and no one ever challenged them. And those guys were preventing the bill from passing, getting to the Senate. So it was literally the Democrats, but they were Southern Democrats who
right,
were preventing it, even though the rest of the country wanted it. I
right,
agree with you. I agree with you on this show horse versus workhorse thing. And I think what the movie shows you is you need to be kind of both, right? You need to be able to
yeah,
be legislatively smart, but you also need to deliver eloquent speech and or be persuasive to the public as a whole. You need to be able to work
right,
back room and to the nation as a whole, because the climax of the movie is that speech to the joint session, and it's at that point where Johnson really achieves his gets national unity and all that kind of stuff. Now you're right, he had one good speech in him. That was probably it. His speeches became television addresses became less and less effective as he went on, mostly because he was out of step with the time. But anyway, yeah, that's what I think is relevant.
I also think that it didn't explicitly bring this up, but you mentioned the committee chairman. Ultimately, ultimately, I think Johnson was able to bypass the couple of the powerful chairman to get the legislation to the floor. And then you had, guess what? The filibuster.
Yeah.
And filibuster is a big issue today that everybody's talking about. And I think it is worth noting, I happen to be one who thinks shouldn't be there, but it is worth noting that the reason why basic civil rights in this country took so long was because of two things. One, Democrats, and two, the filibuster. No, if you want to be
No,
honest,
of
those
course.
were the
Yes, of
reasons.
course. Yes.
Those were the reasons. And I'm glad a Democrat finally was able to preside over the signing of that very important bill.
If you were a high school teacher, would you sign this movie?
Well, it gets back to my F-bomb
Yeah.
issue. I'd love to. I'd love to, because it very accurately lays out a set of issues. It's not offensive racially. It really isn't.
Mm.
And it's not offensive politically. I mean, it doesn't, nobody would, you know, boycott their schools. It's just those F and F bombs.
Right, I agree with you. If you get a version that scrubs out all the potty mouthed language, I would say absolutely. I agree with you.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, grade. How do you grade the movie?
A minus, not because it's high art or fantastic filmmaking, but because it does everything presidential history and folklore buffs would want in a movie about a real president navigating real events and us being a fly on the wall witnessing it.
Well, I would get it graded higher. Yes, I would grade it pretty high for accuracy, but overall, I mean, I give it a B. I think it's a fine movie, but just not interest. I mean, it's the subject matter is interesting. The way it's made is just not interesting to me.
Mhm.
So, all right. So, anything else you want to say about this movie before we wrap this up?
No, I think we've done it.
We've gone all the way with this movie. So I'll just say that the podcast is available, Spotify, Amazon, Apple, most podcast platforms. Please subscribe there. Our next movie will be a film called Pressure, in which a weatherman is the main character. That movie is about Eisenhower's decision to launch the D-Day invasion, and it will be in the theaters at the end of May. So unless you are a Hollywood big shot with access to screeners, you'll have to join us at the theaters to see it. So Jim, you and I will probably go to the movies with our little notebooks and take notes while that movie's going on and not be able to read them when we get home. That's what I did with Reagan.
Same here. And maybe by us doing that, some of our listeners won't need to go see the movie because we'll report that it's terrible or vice versa.
Yeah, I have a feeling it's not good. I'll just tell. I mean, I
Oh,
hope I'm pleasantly surprised because no
keep
one
an
wants.
open mind.
I'm going to keep an open mind, but
I mean, it
I'm
is
just
about an earlier period in the life of the greatest president in American history.
yeah, and it's one of it's like the climactic moment of the 20th century. It's about the single most important thing that happened in the 20th century, aside from us being born. And so yeah, so I'm hoping it's good, but we'll find out. You guys will have to wait until probably in June. So okay, Jim, bye bye.
Take care.